All right, so now we'll listen to Antony Stone telling us something about monitoring the real world. Enjoy.
I'm going to do this the best I can. We're going to lose the right-hand part of the screen, but I can't seem to adjust that. I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm going to talk about monitoring the real world. Just to make sure we're all on the same page to begin with, I want to define what I mean by monitoring. I don't think that's going to be anything too unusual, but I want to make sure that we've got the same definitions. And also, what do I mean by the real world? Monitoring for me consists of three essential items. A few nice add-ons as well, but you've got to be measuring something. If you're not measuring something, well, you're not talking about anything definite. You've got to have some metrics. You've got to have some information to work on, hard data. I also like very much to have archiving, a historical record of what those measurements were. Not just what's the value now, but what's been happening in the past, how does it vary from what we've seen before. It's not essential, but for me it makes a big difference, and I'll show you that as we go through some of the examples here. Monitoring also means more than measuring. You've got to compare against some thresholds, because you've got to decide, is this okay? Is this a problem? Am I concerned about this? You've got to have some measure of, is this normal usage? Is this normal performance? Or is this getting critical? Is this something that needs attention? And then finally, monitoring itself needs to have some form of alerting or response. It's all very well doing measuring and comparing, but if you don't tell somebody about a problem, they're not going to react, and you've just got a historical record of, yeah, something went wrong. You can see that in the standard log files and so on. So for me, those are the three essential parts of a monitoring system. You've got to measure some hard data, compare it against some thresholds, and let somebody know or react in some way when it goes beyond those thresholds. It could be an automated response. It doesn't have to involve a person, but we know that it often does. So what am I talking about with the real world? We're all used to monitoring networks and computers and so on. That's the standard use of Isinger and Nagios and Zabbix and OpenNMS and everything else. But I'm not going to be talking about that. So I'm not talking about disk usage, process counts, number of telephones connected, network bandwidth, stuff like that. That's all very important, but it's not the subject of today's talk. I'm more interested in things like, what's the weather? What sort of power production or power consumption are we experiencing? What's the healthy state of my fish tank? Or how are the bees getting on in the hive outside? Stuff like that. Those are just some examples I've done of the sorts of things in the real world that we can monitor, still have an interest in, and want to have a response and a reaction to. So, if you don't measure something, then there's no information, and without archiving, there's no history or trends. If you don't compare things, it's just a dumb recorder. You're gathering data, but you're not putting any interpretation on it. You're not putting any significance on what is the value at the moment. And if you don't respond, you may as well not bother doing the monitoring, because you're not actually reacting to the situation you see at the time. You're just being able to look historically at, yeah, something happened. It can be interesting, but it's not really what we want in terms of keeping things going and being able to respond to something when it's appropriate to do so. You may only have a limited time frame in which to perform a response, and I'll show you some examples as we go through. Some of the examples that I'm going to show here do interact with other people's systems. So I just want to put a cautionary disclaimer here. Some of the measurements presented here do collect data from other organizations, such as eBay or Amazon or various banks and so on. And please note that some of them do have acceptable use conditions. Policies which indicate how you may or may not interact with them. So if you do choose to implement some of the things that I'm presenting here, do bear in mind that you're responsible for making sure that you are within their acceptable use policy. What they will do if you go beyond that is up to them, but you should be able to find that on each of their websites and so on. I'll discuss a specific example a bit later on when I get to one of them, where I found out, oh, they do have an acceptable use policy and I'm not within it. I wasn't aware of that beforehand, but it soon became apparent, and I adjusted things so that it works better now. So, on to some real-world examples. Lots of people use solar power generation these days, either in industrial installations for powering buildings and data centers and so on, or just domestic installations where you want to use the spare space on your roof, and you can actually sell the electricity back to the electricity generating companies. I must admit, I'm not quite sure how the economics of this work out, because you often find that the price you can sell it to them at is higher than what they charge you for getting electricity from them under normal conditions. So it's obviously an incentive of some sort to get this kick-started and going, but it's an interesting economic situation. So I've got a friend who lives, I guess, about 150 kilometers north of here. And he decided some years ago, about 10 years ago or so, to implement a solar power installation on his roof. That's an example of one of his panels. I don't know quite how many panels he's got now, but these are some of the images that he sent of the installation that he's got. And he works as an instrumentation engineer in the first place. So he's got an interest in measurements and the sort of equipment that is used in industrial situations for measuring and monitoring power consumption, power distribution, power production, as well as quite a number of environmental factors. That comes into it as well. So he's got an ambient light sensor, which is this one over here. That is simply in order to record what sort of ambient light is there, quite independently of whatever the solar panel is capable of generating. Sorry about the caption here, but this one is a rain sensor. You're not missing much of the picture. It looks a bit like a small upside-down bucket, and there's a funnel inside it which collects rain and then gives him a measure of what has been the rainfall within a certain period of time. And because his interest in, and job indeed, is in instrumentation and collecting data from various pieces of equipment, he's added quite a number of different sensors to the system around the house. And he not only measures the solar power generation that his setup is creating, but he's also measuring several areas of temperature, both indoors and outdoors. So up in the loft, the roof space of his building, down in the cellar, externally at a couple of different heights. He measures humidity as well, which is quite important for the well-being of some of the electronics that he's got installed in the cellar, for example. Ambient air pressure is an interesting weather indicator. He also measures his household power consumption. Now, that's not something that everybody would find easy to do, because the power companies don't generally like you connecting anything in at the point where the power comes into the house before it gets distributed. But if you know how to connect that up and you've got access to the appropriate equipment, you can measure how much power is the entire house using. Obviously, you can also implement various little bits of equipment which would monitor the consumption of individual devices, or maybe individual rooms, depending on the wiring they've got. Somehow or other, he's also managed to include gas consumption and water usage, and as I say, he's got the rain gauge. So he's got quite a lot of instrumentation around the place, measuring various aspects of what the house is up to. This is what one of his cupboards looks like. He's got a section on power supplies and distribution for the main supply from the power company, his solar generation part of it, and also a battery backup so that the entire instrumentation side continues working even if he has a power failure and it's not very sunny. There's a similarly complicated piece of equipment on the other side. It's about that wide, so same size as that. And that is the interfaces. This is the main controller board, which collects all of the data from the various items of telemetry that's got around the house, and does the data processing and the logging, stores the information, and then presents it available to him as an interface such as this. Yeah, we can see pretty much all of that there. So he's got various pieces of data down the side to do with how much solar power is being generated, what power usage he's got, what gas usage, water, temperatures, outside up on his roof, outside down near the ground, air pressure and so on, and then the typical graphs of what those have been doing over the past 24 hours. he also chose, by the way, to stick a camera on his roof, so it just happens to look out over the town, not at anything in particular, but it gives a good indication of the prevailing weather conditions. He uses this mainly for monitoring in terms of previous performance and checking when does he generate most electricity, when is he consuming most electricity, how could he improve the performance of this installation. There's not a great deal of alerting in this, apart from things like humidity or water level in case there's a leak around the place. If the cellar gets either too humid or flooded, there's a concern about the electronics there. So, and these, these devices here. Yeah, these are mounted down in the cellar near to the power distribution network for the house in general. So he uses that just for being alerted in case there is a problem with the condition of the electronics. So obviously he's gone to quite an extent here based on the equipment he's got available at work. And his knowledge of doing that, but is a good indication of how you can extend measurements of all sorts of kinds to what is rapidly becoming quite a common installation in a domestic environment as well as an industrial one. Moving on to a completely different topic, I quite like keeping a track of my bank account. We have a question. I would prefer the questions at the end, thanks. It's easier with the microphone apart from anything else. I quite like monitoring my bank account. However, I don't want to have to log in every day. Lots of banks have online banking systems these days so that you can log in, do transactions and so on. These happen to be three of the ones that I use. I have a business account with Santander, I have a personal account in England with the Bank of Scotland, and a personal account in Germany with Deutsche Bank. So I thought, how complicated can it be to write a script to log in using the appropriate credentials, find the bit that says this is your current balance, and then represent it some way. And it turns out not very difficult at all. I don't intend to go through this in detail, but I just wanted to give you an indication that written in Bash, this is a summary of how straightforward it is to get the information. This one is Deutsche Bank. So on the first line you see there's a URL for where to log in. There's a couple of paths to files that they use for the login process. I've written it so that it can either do through the English language interface or the German language interface. They do provide both. And then I've simply got a couple of wget commands, which use cookies from the previous login. Session cookies are used by Deutsche Bank, so it can maintain the identity from the login process to fetch my balance. And then depending on whether it got the right answer from the second wget, there may be a third one in order to actually find out what the balance is. And then finally, you simply do a search for that magic phrase, English or German, a few bits of text processing in order to pick out the right field, and there you have the balance. Right at the end, you may recognize that is a fairly standard performance data output to Isinga or Nagios. And here is a check that I've written. This one is Isinga 1. I'll have some examples from Isinga 2 for a couple of them later. So there's a check command called check Deutsche Bank. I check it every 60 minutes. If there's a problem, why not? Actually, that makes a lot more sense with English banks. German banks typically only do transactions overnight, and they take a hell of a long time, 3 days often, to actually notice that you've been sent some money. With English banks, if I make a transaction from Santander to Bank of Scotland, by the time I can log into Bank of Scotland, it's there and I can see it. So transactions happen throughout the day, and they really do happen pretty much the moment somebody has sent the money. So yeah, checking a bank balance once an hour is not ridiculous after all. And that's the sort of output that you get. So that is that is 1 year. And I set a warning threshold of €1,000 and a critical threshold of 200, simply because I quite like to know, is there any risk that my rent is not going to be paid? That's about €1,000 a month. And I don't really want to go overdrawn, so if it gets below 200, I might need to try and get some money from somewhere else in a hurry. So that's why I set those alarm thresholds. And it really does send me emails to tell me your bank balance is getting critically low in case you hadn't noticed. Once you've got some money, you might want to spend it. And there's plenty of interesting things on Amazon. So, for example, I might decide that I fancy a fluffy penguin, priced at €49.95. Wow. And it's only 30 centimetres, 1 foot high. So that seems quite expensive for a penguin of that size, I think. So how about tracking the price of things on Amazon and getting an alert sent to me when the prices come down to a level that I'm happy with? I don't know how many people have looked at items on Amazon and then looked at them again a day or a week or a month later and realised, the price has changed. I wonder how much more it might change, and so on. Prices on Amazon really do change quite remarkably and quite quickly. So here again is a script that I've written, once again with the performance data at the bottom, and that will fetch the price of an Amazon item. It does not log in as me, so this is nothing specific to me as a user. This will simply fetch the price of an item on Amazon given the product ID, which if you look at an item, I don't know that I've... No, it's not actually on there. If you look a bit further down from the product description, you have what's called an ASIN, Amazon something identity number. Oh, something sounds good enough. Starts with an S. Yeah, it could be Amazon standard identity number. So once you've found that out, you simply put that in to your Isinga object as the thing that you want to monitor. And this will then go off and check the price for you. Here we have the definition of it. So this is the check command, which passes over the ASIN, your critical and warning levels. I tend to use this along the lines of, the warning level is something where, if it's come down that much, I'm interested. The critical level is, if it's come down that much, I'm going to buy it. So I want to know the difference between, has it really come down enough that I'm going to go for it, or am I just going to be interested and think, well, I might do, depending on how much I need it at the moment. There's a service check for applying the price to some item, and this is a nice example of something I do quite a lot with Isinga. I define a service, and I apply it to any object which has got the appropriate parameter defined. So if I have given something an object which contains a variable called Amazon ASIN, it automatically gets checked in this way. I don't have to define that check for every individual object that I then create. And there is an example of an object. So I've put in the name of it. It's a set of books. The check command is dummy because there's no way of doing a ping check on a book on Amazon. So I don't want Isinga to tell me this thing is down all the time. And that's the... unless the price is down, that is. And that is the identity number. And what you get is a service output of the price, a historical summary of that, and as you can see, sometimes it's quite interesting. That is a summary of this year. So week 40 is around about September, I think. Of the price of that item. It's a set of 4 books that are available on Amazon. And you can see how the price fluctuates between 2 standard levels, but occasionally goes even more extreme. And if you look in detail, that is one weekend. So I believe I looked at that weekend there. Might have been that one, I'm not sure, but I think it's that weekend there. I went into more detail. And that shows you how the price of an item can change on Amazon. Notice that these are hourly measurements. So Friday morning, it was €10, or £10, £10 I think. Then it came down to £5, it then came down to 2. Stayed there for an hour, went back up to 10. And this really is what happens to some of the prices on Amazon. This is the point at which I found out what their acceptable use policy was. Because if you monitor the price of anything, just a single item on Amazon once per hour, after a couple of days, they say, we're not very happy about this. And you get a little pop-up message in the browser response saying, we need to prove that you are a person and not a robot. Now, of course, this is a robot, so it doesn't respond, so I ran out of data. They don't do anything beyond that. Once you've logged in a few times, and as long as you do not carry on checking things once per hour, then it all comes back to normal. What I have found is if you check once a day, that's all right. That's no problem. But yeah, once per hour or even more frequently, they do notice. There are ways of doing that perfectly legitimately. You can get an API key from Amazon, which means that you've got a perfectly legitimate opportunity to check prices more often, but they only issue that once they've got your identity and know who you are and have an idea why you're doing it. So it is possible to do, but even if you don't have that API key, you can still check once a day for prices of things. Here's another example of an object that I was looking at. That's a year's tracking of the price of an item, and that was particularly interesting. So that is the first 4 weeks of January, and you can see that the price was £15, came down to about £8, and was even below 5 for several days. And obviously, if you're interested in buying things, but you're not too bothered about when, it's good to have a check that will tell you the price has radically come down, now is the time to get it. So, moving on from banks or Amazon and so on, let's have a look at some animals. I'll start small, bees. Plenty of people keep bees, and they live in hives out in the middle of nowhere, but you want to know how they're getting on. That's an example of some bees. So you have several thousand of these living in a wooden hive, and if you've got an electronics bench, you might add some instrumentation to them. There's quite a few things that are worth measuring about bees. Firstly, what's the temperature inside their hive? I don't know if anybody here is familiar with beehives, but they're basically wooden boxes with a bit of ventilation, but that's it. There's no artificial heating. They just live out in the open air, but the bees themselves maintain the temperature remarkably constantly, it turns out. And it's a good indication of how happy they are, how well they're getting on with things. If you measure the sound inside the hive, how much noise are the bees making? What sort of noise are the bees making? That can give you an exceedingly good indicator of, are they about to split into two and one part of the hive will swarm off and go and set up a new home somewhere? If that happens, you've probably lost half of your bees. Somebody might phone you up and say, can you come and collect some bees, please? And if they're yours, you're very happy. But if you can predict that they're going to swarm, that means you can split the hive yourself, put them into two separate wooden hives, and carry on working with them. Often the purpose of keeping bees is you want to get honey from them. So if you weigh the hive and simply put pressure sensors underneath the feet, you can have a good idea of maybe how many bees there are inside the hive, but that only changes over a long-term basis. But how much honey have they generated? What's actually inside the hive? And you can do that non-invasively. It means you don't have to open the hive and disturb the bees and have a look around at what they've been doing. So they're much happier like that. Here we are again with the hive with the lid off. A large number of bees inside, making this honeycomb with plenty of honey in it. On the top is a bit of instrumentation. That's based around an Arduino board with, at the moment, just some temperature sensors. That gives you an idea of the size of it. The board itself is about 5 centimeters long, and attached to that is a temperature probe. That's what the temperature probe looks like. It's homemade, but so there's a temperature sensor there, cabling, another sensor in there, more cabling, and just off the end of it, unfortunately because of the screen, there's a third sensor. And these photographs and these sensors have been provided to me by another couple of friends who live near Cambridge in England. They keep these bees out in a paddock field near to their home. And because they're into electronics and software and so on, they've set up this automatic monitoring for them. And the point is, this is difficult because beehives are generally not near to a convenient main socket. You can't plug it in to keep an eye on how they're getting on. So because they're some distance away, you need to find a way of transmitting this data wirelessly and with very, very low power. And what these people have done is they've used UK HASNet. HAS stands for High Altitude Society. And basically it's a group of people who got together in order to provide equipment, very small electronics, which can be used for high altitude, weather balloons and that sort of thing. Equipment which you want to send up into the atmosphere, powered and lightweight, but able to send continuous data back to a base station on Earth in order to be able to give a real-time indication of what the conditions are. You can't rely on storing the data while the thing is away and then recovering it later, because you may never recover the thing. You've got no idea where it'll end up. So it's got to be lightweight to be able to travel on the balloon, cheap, because you might not get it back, and low power so that it can transmit something over a decent period of time. What this society has come up with is a simple mesh network protocol. So it's based on each station being able to see another station and data being transmitted and relayed from one section to another across the network. And this network covers Europe and several other countries around the world, depending on the number of people who are interested. You can get a cheap module, less than £10, on a license-free radio frequency, so you can just implement it and send it up into the atmosphere without any concerns. And it has a relay routing network, so you don't have to be within radio range of the object that you've set up. You don't have to have your own base station if you don't want to. You've also got connectivity to a web address, and that means that you can recover information through a web interface rather than, again, having to have a radio interface to get this data. And this is the sort of thing they get out of it. This data is from this year, week 9 through to week 13, so that's something like March of this year. And these two graphs are of two levels of sensors in the same beehive. So D1 is fairly low down in the beehive, D2 is much higher up, and it gives you an indication. You can see the general trends are similar, but the variation, the sensor low down is quite a lot more as cold air comes in through the ventilation. By the time it reaches the middle, or yeah, D2 is the middle and D3 is the top. By the time it reaches the middle of the beehive, the bees have managed to regulate the temperature quite a lot more, and there's far less variation in that temperature over quite some period of time. And it's worth commenting that in March in Cambridgeshire, the ambient temperature is considerably below 10 degrees centigrade. So the bees are maintaining the temperature themselves. Another hive, which is actually much more populated, for the same period, you can see has got a much higher temperature in general and far less variation. This hive is near to the other one, but it has a far more mature population of bees, a far larger population of bees, and it shows you how good they are at maintaining their temperature. You can see virtually no daily rhythm there, no daily cycle, as it gets cold at night and warm in the day. And by monitoring this, you've got a good idea of how happy the bees are, how they're getting on, and as I say, by measuring the weight of the hive as well, you can get an indication of the honey production without having to go out, inconveniently to you, and without having to disturb the bees themselves, which means that they are happier and do a better job. Some people keep tropical fish instead of bees. You can keep these indoors, so they're much more straightforward from that point of view. Tropical fish live in warm salt water, but they're very sensitive to their environment. There are various things which are of concern to them, and variation over quite a narrow range can be important to them, and they can be quite liable to diseases or even death as a result of these things not being right. Fish in a tank are far more vulnerable to changes in their environment when they're living in the sea, because you've got a smaller water volume and a small change in chemicals in that water, has proportionately a far greater effect. There's no dilution of the fact that fresh water will come in from somewhere else and take away waste materials and so on. You also often have a higher population density of fish in a tank than you would do in the open sea. So again, changes in the environment are going to have an effect on a far larger number of fish. They can't swim off and find a more pleasant environment for themselves instead. You usually have a less diverse ecosphere as well. You don't have the other plants and animals which are capable of dealing with the waste materials. So, some enterprising organization has taken a standard Arduino board and produced an Arduino shield for it called Open Aquarium. And they produce a temperature sensor. There's just a couple of wires sticking out on the end of that. They've produced a pH sensor and a conductivity sensor. A water level sensor, which just sits near the top of the tank and has a float in it to check the level of the water. And when you've connected everything up, you've got these various sensors in a tank. That's a standard aquarium heater. That's an air pump for maintaining air circulation throughout the water. And then you've got this Arduino board up at the top doing all sorts of various instrumentation. And again, it's good to be doing this on a continuous basis so that you've got a continuous measurement of the conditions in the tank. If the nitrate levels, for example, which are a representative of the waste products produced by fish, if those nitrate levels get too high, you want to react fairly quickly. Within 24 hours, if you leave it for 48 or 72 hours, you will probably have dead fish by then. Not all of them, but the more sensitive ones. So you want to be able to react to things as quickly as possible. Traditionally, the way of monitoring things like that is with chemical test kits, where you take a little sample of water out of the tank, put it into a container, apply reagents and so on, and then you get a color indication of what concentration you've got. Being able to do all of this electronically and continuously is a far more convenient solution and a far better solution from the point of view of reacting as quickly as you can to keep the fish comfortable and happy. Of course, they've gone a bit further. Here is the standard base board. They've also added on a wireless interface so that you can then connect this lot up to the network and monitor things from a web interface or through basically anything on a standard data network that then means you could feed it into Isinger or Zabbix if you wanted to. The company that produced these things, they provide a web interface that just has standard indicators of the current conditions and historical trends, rather than expecting people to use a normal computer network management system. But obviously, if you're a geek, you can make this work with anything that you want to along the lines of a monitoring network. Going a bit bigger, some people keep cows. We generally call them farmers. And there are particular times when you're especially interested in how the cow's getting on. Are they happy? Mainly when they're pregnant and they're going to produce another cow. There's not a great deal of time between thinking that a cow is about to give birth and it actually doing so, and you don't want to have to keep on wandering out to the barn and keeping an eye on this all the time. About 20% of cows have complications during the first time they give birth to a calf. That's quite a high proportion. Even what's described as more experienced cows have complications during about 8% of births. So 20% of the time cows giving birth for the first time have a problem, and this problem could result in the death of the calf, for example. Very, very occasionally, the death of the cow itself. But 3% of all calves die during birth. And for farmers, that's quite an economic consideration. The cost of keeping and feeding a cow over the period of time that it takes to give birth to another cow, and they only give birth to one at a time, it's not like puppies or something, means that 3% dying during birth. If you can do anything to improve on that, then it's a good idea to do so. So if you can get any sort of advance warning that a cow is going to give birth in the next few hours, this gives farmers a good benefit, a good advantage in making sure that they don't experience problems. So somebody has come up with a device which I can only express as you insert this into your cow. It is an internally fitted sensor. It monitors the temperature of the cow, and it monitors the contractions associated with giving birth. It has a short-range wireless connection to a relay device, which then allows the farmer to be notified by a slightly more standard text message or something. And the alert is provided generally by SMS to a mobile phone. That's a summary of the kit of parts that you get, where this is the device which you insert into the cow. That's the relay station which you plug in somewhere nearby. So it's a short-range wireless connection, I don't know, 10 to 50 meters, something like that. So within the barn where the cows live. You normally have cows contained within an indoor environment. When they're about to give birth in the next week or so, you don't tend to let them wander around open in the fields because it's quite likely that they give birth out in the open. The young calf will have problems because of the temperature. So you keep them indoors. And then there's a little wireless antenna which is used. And this thing contains a SIM card and has all the necessary connections for GSM communication onto the mobile network. Now that seems quite a neat idea, but it's not necessary for everybody. And fortunately, somebody else has come up with a non-invasive method of doing this. So you can place a sensor on the tail of the cow. And what it does, it actually measures the movement of tail patterns. It measures patterns of tail movement. It turns out that if you monitor the way a cow is moving its tail, it changes the way it does that when it's about to give birth to a calf. And when I say about to, something like an hour or so from now. So the device monitors the intensity of these tail movements over a period of time. There's a preset threshold which indicates, yeah, the cow is likely to give birth soon. And it sends an SMS text alert, on average, 1 hour before birth takes place. I've just realized that there's something here I should have plugged in a little earlier. I haven't explained this, but I will do later. I shall move that to there and then tell you why in a few minutes. I was distracted by trying to get the screen running, unfortunately. Anyway, so it then sends a text alert to the farmer, on average, 1 hour before the cow is about to give birth. And that gives plenty of opportunity for either the farmer or a vet to be able to attend and see, is the cow having difficulty, is the calf having difficulty, and save quite a large proportion of those 3%. That's what the device looks like. So it's a plastic device about that size, has a hole in the center and a clip around the edge, and you simply clip this onto the tail of the cow, which I consider to be far more convenient than the previous one that we saw. That's an example of how you put it on. So there's a cow's tail there. Place the device around it, clip it on, and then it immediately sends an alert to your telephone to say, OK, I'm installed, powered, detecting some movement, and you can check that the thing is able to give you an alert. This device itself contains all of the GSM electronics and the SIM card in order to be able to send out the alerts. So it's completely self-contained. That doesn't depend on having another base station anywhere within the barn or within the vicinity. You don't have to have power nearby, for example. And the batteries inside this thing are designed to last for about 10 days, 2 weeks or so, because you would often place it onto a cow something like a week before you expect birth is going to occur. You've got that sort of predictability. But you don't know the exact day, you certainly don't know the exact hour. And these sorts of things help considerably. And it fits into my definition of monitoring simply because it's measuring something specific. It's measuring the movements of the cow or the contractions of the cow in the previous version. It's comparing them against a threshold of what is normal, what indicates something that is of interest, and then it sends an alert when it passes that threshold so that somebody can react. And reaction in this case means a better health for the cow and for the calf, and better economics for the farmer. The last example I want to give involves Lego. I placed an object here on the lectern and didn't mention what it was. But I'll give you a live demonstration now. There's a light on the front of this which is flashing every now and again. Those of you who are in a position to see it, I'll mention it when it does it, will see that it's one of 3 different colours. That's just flashed green. It's actually connected up to a movement device here, which I plugged in earlier. And it doesn't really matter what this is measuring. It could be the position of something, it could be the temperature of something, it could be a water level. I'm just using this as an indicator of a measurement taking place. If I move this over into the yellow area here, then the next flashes which occur on the front will be approximately yellow or orange, and so on. And while it's doing that, I shall switch over to the next screen. Oh, good. Right. I'll come back to that in a moment. So, what we have here is a position indication. That says 101 at the moment. And there's a warning level at 90. And you can see up at the top, this is a standard iSinger 2 interface, and you can see up the top there is a warning level which has been true for 46 seconds. If I move this over into the red section, then the next measurement that we get, which will be very soon now, within the next few seconds. The next measurement that we get should show a critical value up there. Oh, good, lovely. And it shows that the position is now 139. So it's showing the position of this. It's actually just measuring the rotation from 0 through to 90 through to 180. If I put it back to something around about 50 or so, then we'll see that the position comes back to something like 50, and the critical alert will disappear. It's measuring roughly every 20 seconds or so it shouldn't take too long to do one. Oh, okay, so the position is 61. I was slightly under-optimistic about my measurement. And as you can see, it's building up the graph here. Let's see if I can get that shown a bit better. So if I zoom in to this section of the graph, we can see that it is monitoring the position of that sensor, and it will come back down. It does take PNP for Nagios a little while to react with the round-robin database that it uses as a back-end, but it will come back down into the non-critical level in order to represent the current measurement value of 61. There's a couple of measurements that I'm doing on this thing at the moment. The position of the pointer is one of them, and the battery level, it uses rechargeable batteries inside, is the other one. And we can see a similar graph of that. If I switch back to the services, the other service I've got is battery. And if I look at the 4-hour graph this time, actually, let's try 25 to see whether... Yes, that will show the decrease a little easier on the space I've got available in the screen. You can see the drop in battery level since I switched it on at around about lunchtime. Now, that's not particularly exciting or interesting. However, the whole reason why I brought this along is the iSinger monitoring system is running inside there. This is running iSinger. I was intrigued that that was at all possible, and I've brought along the demonstration simply to show that that works. What it's based on is it's a Lego Mindstorms brick. There's 3 generations of them over the years. I've got little pictures of them here, but yeah, the earliest one is from 1998, and Lego themselves produce a graphical programming environment for these things, which I find horrible. I can't use it. I'm a text programmer. Somebody came up with a language called Not Quite C. It looks like C, it feels like C, but it's limited, it's restricted because of the capabilities of this thing. There's no floating point maths, for example, and there's only a limited range of functions available for it. You don't have extensive maths libraries, stuff like that. But if you can program in C, you can get on with this language perfectly well. When Lego themselves produced the next version in 2006, they open sourced the firmware as well, the entire software that's loaded onto the machine. They produce software development kits to encourage other people to actually come up with alternative programming environments. The response of the people who developed Not Quite C was to take the initials here and come up with Not Exactly C, which was a derivative which took account of the greater capabilities of the hardware in this thing. Just to give you an idea of what the hardware is, by the way, the earliest version, it's an 8-bit H8 processor running at 16 megahertz, and it's got 32K of RAM inside it. Your programs fit into 32 kilobytes of RAM. The next version, they boosted it up to a 32-bit ARM7 processor running at a whopping 48 megahertz, and they fitted it with 64 kilobytes of RAM. The latest version, this one here, has a 32-bit ARM9. It's been around since 2013. Runs at 300 megahertz and has 64 megabytes of RAM now. The amusing thing about it from my point of view is Lego supply it running Linux natively. When you buy it, it's got Linux inside it. They don't make a big issue out of that. They don't expect people to program it that way. Certainly the children that it's aimed at don't really care. But it runs Linux natively by default. So a group came up with an alternative version called EV3Dev, and it's a Debian Linux-based distribution which you can install onto the device to make it far more like Linux. EV3, as it's supplied by Lego, is designed for programming, again, with their graphical environment and simply based around motors and sensors you can plug in. This puts a far more standard Linux distribution onto your Lego brick. And this is what it looks like. When you log into it, you get a welcome login. It's running Debian Jessie on it. Yes, you've got the last login. And if you list the contents of /etc/isinga2, you've got all of the standard directories there. I'll show you that on this one. I've got a login session here. So up in the top left-hand corner of this display, I can see its IP address. It's connected to the OSMC wireless network here. So if I log into that, Robot is a standard username that's installed on the machine by default. I've installed my public key on it, so from this laptop I can log in without a password. Anybody else is welcome to ping that address, but you won't be able to SSH to it. And I get the standard welcome message there. If I say something like uname, I can find out. Yes, its hostname is EV3Dev. It's running a 4.4 kernel. It's got an ARM version 5 processor in it. And yes, it's got a standard Debian Jessie installation. And you can install whatever packages you like, as long as they fit in 64 megabytes of RAM, or as long as they will run sensibly in 64 megabytes of RAM. The way you actually put this system onto the Lego brick is quite simple. It has a micro SD card slot in the side. You put the image onto that, plug it in, and then the next time you turn it on, it boots from that instead of from its internal firmware. So you're not replacing the internal firmware. And you can, as I say, use apt to install standard packages and run Linux applications on your Lego brick, such as isinga. So, I'd like to thank a few people for the information they've given me and the help they've given me and the pictures they've provided for this presentation. Martin Gluntz is the guy behind the solar power installation with the instrumentation. Jenny Bailey and Jennifer Liddle run the beehives and gave me the images from that. There's a company called Open Aquarium, which you can find plenty of information out on cookinghacks.com. I'm not quite sure what it's got to do with cooking, because it kind of bothers me that you're keeping tropical fish and you find out how to monitor them from cooking hacks. Makes you think, how often does this go wrong? And then the two cow monitoring systems, which I showed you, the internal one from Unitronic and the external one from MooCall. So, that was my overview of monitoring all sorts of things in the real world that you wouldn't normally come across with Icinga or Zabbix or Navigios or whatever, and how useful it can be to actually put instrumentation in unusual places. Do we have any questions? Yes. Do we have a microphone? Lovely.
So how many people have used your account contents besides you so far? Or to put the question that probably everybody had, don't your banks use two-factor authentication? And how can you sleep?
Okay. Deutsche Bank does use two-factor authentication when you want to make a transaction. However, to log in and get read-only access, no, you just have a standard, well, not exactly a username and a password. Deutsche Bank wants to know your branch number, which is public information, your account number, which is public information, and a 5-digit PIN code, which isn't. And that's it. With that, you can log in to Deutsche Bank and see the account. If you want to make a transaction, then you need a one-time password, which you get from them. With Santander and Bank of Scotland, there are no one-time passwords. So with both of those, I need to log in with two pieces of information, which are private to me, but then I can make whatever transactions I like. Now, obviously, there is a security consideration of the machine that's running the Icinga instance that needs to be able to do the login. But my attitude to that is, provided that is on an internal network to myself, I can only make outbound connections to the external world, and is protected by firewalls or network address translation or whatever for inbound connections, I'm happy with that.
Okay, the Deutsche Bank was, the situation with the Deutsche Bank was what I was kind of expecting and hoping for. The other one still would give me a bit of creeps.
Yeah.
And I have to admit that I also expected 3-level temperature monitoring in cows, but well, that's probably later, like with the bees, like lower level temperature and so on. Okay, thank you. So, next question.
Okay, anybody else?
Anyone else?
Right at the front here.
One question and one comment. How often has your scraping of the Deutsche Bank failed? In terms of if they change something, then your scraping breaks.
Yeah, you're right. Scraping a website is a risk in terms of they changed the interface. They actually changed it about 10 days, 2 weeks ago, but not in a way that affected my script. I've been running that script for 18 months now, something like that, without any problems. However, you're correct. Coming up with something like this myself, which isn't officially supported by them, is vulnerable to them changing, oh, we've got a wonderful new appearance to our website, you now log in using the following things instead, and it all falls over. So it can happen. It has happened with Amazon, but it was relatively easy to fix. I get the advantage that, as you saw earlier, the scripts themselves are quite simple. There's not very many web fetches needed in order to get at the data. But it could happen, you're right.
Thank you. And then just one comment. It was a great talk, very good fun. And there's only one way you can improve it. Next time, bring a cow.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.